12,000 years. That is how long the conquered of 12 suns has ruled the stars. 12,000 years of order, 12,000 years of law, 12,000 years without a single species breaking rank. The conquered does not conquer. The conquered does not need to. It only has to vote. Every species that joins kneels before a table of light in a chamber built inside a dead star. Every species learns the same lesson: obey the vote or face the Armada. The Armada has never lost. 4,000 warships, 11,000 light-years of reach, a fleet older than most civilizations it has erased. Its commanders do not remember the last time they were afraid. That is about to change. Far from the dead star, past the edge of a spiral arm nobody important ever bothered to map, a small yellow sun warms a small blue planet. The conquered cataloged it centuries ago. File number 4471 Terra. Status: developing. Threat level: negligible. Nobody in the conquered read the full file. If they had, they might have noticed something strange. The species on file 4471 had been observed exactly once, and the observers never reported back. That was 40 years ago. Nobody asked why. Now the Council is asking a different question, not whether humanity is dangerous, whether humanity is convenient. And in the halls of the conquered, convenience always wins the vote. The chamber inside the dead star burns cold blue light across 12 empty thrones and one very full gallery. Delegates from 600 worlds fill the seats. Insectoid diplomats click their mandibles. Gas-based ambassadors drift inside pressurized spheres. A silver-skinned Korathi elder stands at the center podium, 4 eyes scanning the room. His name is Fleet Marshal Threx Ilan Vase. He has broken 11 civilizations in his 300 years of service. He has never lost a vote he sponsored. Species designation Terran, he says. His voice carries without a microphone. The chamber goes silent. Population, 11 billion. Technological growth rate, unprecedented. Military expansion, unverified but suspected accelerating. A murmur spreads through the gallery. They have not asked to join the conquered, Threx continues. They have not asked for protection. They have not asked for anything. And yet in the last decade, 3 border relay stations near their system have gone dark. He lets that sentence sit in the air. I propose quarantine, full blockade, no contact in, no contact out, until we understand what is growing on that world. A Visari ambassador, a being of coiled smoke and starlight, floats forward. Quarantine seems extreme, Fleet Marshal. Have we made contact at all? We made contact 40 years ago, Threx says. A single scout vessel, standard survey protocol. And the survey findings. Threx pauses, just slightly, just long enough for someone paying attention to notice. The vessel did not report findings, he says. The vessel did not report anything. Silence. It simply stopped transmitting. The gallery erupts into overlapping voices, clicks, chimes, static bursts of translated concern. Threx raises one silver hand and the noise dies. This is precisely why quarantine is necessary, he says. Not conquest, not war, simple containment. A species that swallows a scout ship without a whisper does not get the benefit of the doubt. A vote screen ignites above the 12 thrones, 600 worlds, 600 choices. The numbers climb. 412 worlds vote yes. The conquered of 12 suns has decided, Earth will be quarantined. Threx allows himself something close to a smile. 4 eyes narrowing in something the humans, had they been watching, would have recognized instantly. Arrogance. Fleet Marshal, says a younger officer beside him, a Korathi named Ves Ol Thane, barely 50 years old and eager to prove it. Shall I prepare the standard enforcement package? 200 vessels, blockade formation, standard warning broadcast. Threx looks down at him, with the patience of someone who has done this 100 times. No, he says, send the full Second Fleet, 800 ships. Vess blinks. 800 for one unaligned system. Marshal, that is triple the force we used against the halving uprising, and they had functioning jump drives. The halving uprising had allies, Threx says. This species has nothing, no fleet on record, no colonies beyond their own moon, no weapons signature we have ever detected. He turns to the star map, where a small blue dot pulses quietly in the dark. 800 ships is not for the fight, Threx says. 800 ships is so there is no fight. I want them to see the sky fill with steel and understand, before a single shot is fired, that resistance was never an option. Vess salutes. Understood, Marshal, overwhelming force, no survivors of doubt. Exactly, Threx says. We are not going to war, we are delivering a verdict. 91 days later, the Second Fleet crosses into the outer edge of Sol system. 800 warships, each one longer than the tallest structure humanity has ever built, each one carrying enough firepower to sterilize a continent in an afternoon. They do not hide, they do not need to. The fleet emerges from jump space in a formation shaped like a closing fist, blotting out stars behind the orbit of Neptune. Sensor arrays sweep forward, cataloging the 9th planet, the 8th, the 7th. No response. No hostile contacts, reports the sensor officer, a Korathi named Yurbel Sohn. No defensive platforms, no orbital weapons, no fleet of any kind. Threx stands on the bridge of his flagship, the verdict of suns, watching the blue dot grow larger on the viewscreen. As expected, he says, a species that never left its own solar system in any meaningful way. Marshal Ur says, hesitating, there is something odd. Define odd. Their communications traffic, radio, television, data networks, it's all still running. Normal broadcasts, no panic, no military alerts, no evacuation orders. Threx tilts his head. They don't know we're here. They know, Ur says. Deep space telescopes on their moon logged our arrival within minutes. It's in their public data streams already. People are discussing it, calmly. Vess, standing nearby, lets out a short laugh. Calmly, Marshal, I believe the term for that is denial. Or resignation, Threx says. Either way, it changes nothing. Proceed to blockade formation. Standard perimeter around the 4th planet, 2nd planet, and their moon. Broadcast the quarantine notice on all frequencies. The fleet spreads into position with mechanical precision. 800 ships forming a cage around a solar system that has never seen a warship in its sky. The message goes out in every language humanity has ever recorded, translated by conquered linguistic algorithms trained on decades of intercepted broadcasts. Attention, Terran species. By vote of the conquered of 12 suns, your system is placed under indefinite quarantine. All departures beyond lunar orbit are forbidden. All arrivals are forbidden. Compliance ensures your continued existence. Resistance ensures nothing. On Earth, in a command bunker built 300 meters beneath the Rocky Mountains, a woman in a plain gray uniform listens to the broadcast without expression. Her name is Fleet Admiral Elena Cross. She has been waiting for this message for 39 years, 11 months and 6 days. She sets down her coffee. Well, she says, they're early. Around her, 40 officers turn from their stations. Screens flicker with live feeds from telescopes across the planet, all pointed at the same swarm of alien light gathering beyond Neptune. A young lieutenant, barely out of training, swallows hard. Admiral, 800 ships. Our sensors say each one outmasses our largest vessel by a factor of 6. I know, Elena says. Should we, the lieutenant hesitates. Should we respond? Surrender terms, maybe request negotiation. Elena looks at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has almost, but not quite, understood the lesson. "Lieutenant," she says, "what do you think we've been building under this mountain for 40 years?" The lieutenant doesn't answer. He doesn't need to. Elena turns to the main comm officer. "Send the signal, all shipyards, all stations, all commands." "What signal, Admiral?" Elena allows herself, for the first time in months, a small and dangerous smile. "Tell them," she says, "Phase 1 is complete." The words travel down fiber optic cable, up encrypted satellite relay, out through hollowed asteroids in the belt, into hangars built inside the dark side of the moon, into hidden shipyards drifting silently past the orbit of Jupiter for over 3 decades. In 100 locations no conquered sensor has ever detected, lights begin to turn on. Threx does not know it yet, but the verdict he came to deliver has already been overruled. Across the planet, in the hours after the quarantine broadcast, 11 billion people look up at a sky that suddenly feels smaller than it did the day before. In Lagos, a night market keeps trading under strings of electric lights, vendors arguing about football scores while a muted television in the corner replays telescope footage of 800 points of light gathering beyond Neptune. Nobody stops shopping. Most people assume, reasonably, that it is a hoax or a military exercise or something for governments to worry about, not them. In Tokyo, a woman on her evening commute glances at the alert on her phone, reads the words "indefinite quarantine," and puts the phone back in her pocket, because the train is crowded and she has dinner to make, and the sky, when she looks up through the station skylight, still looks exactly the way it always has. In a control room outside Geneva, the Secretary General of the newly unified Terran Coalition Council watches the same footage on 11 screens at once, flanked by advisors from every major government on the planet, all of whom were read into a secret 40 years in the making within the last 6 hours. "How many people know?" she asks quietly. "Full clearance, everyone in this room," says the advisor beside her. "Partial clearance, roughly 40,000 people worldwide, across every allied government and command structure. Everyone else finds out the way the rest of the planet just did, from the sky." The Secretary General nods slowly, watching the alien fleet hold its silent, patient formation on the screen. And Fleet Admiral Cross is confident. "Fleet Admiral Cross," the advisor says, "has run this exact scenario more times than anyone alive. If she says the plan holds, the plan holds." Not everyone reacts with calm. In a dozen capitals, emergency sessions run through the night. Markets wobble and recover within hours, steadied by government statements calling the objects unconfirmed astronomical phenomena, a lie so old and so practiced that most citizens accept it without a second thought. Fighter jets scramble uselessly over cities with no target to intercept, a reflex from a species that has never had to fight an enemy it could not eventually reach. Underground, in 100 facilities most of those same governments do not officially acknowledge, none of that uncertainty exists. 40 years of drills mean every technician, every pilot, every engineer already knows exactly what comes next. They do not need reassurance. They need confirmation. It arrives at 3:47 hours, Coalition Standard Time, in the form of 5 words relayed from a command bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains to every hidden shipyard on and off the planet. Phase 1 is complete. In the belt beyond Mars, in hollowed asteroids that have hummed quietly with construction for 4 decades, lights that have never fully gone dark burn brighter still. On the far side of the moon, in hangars carved from ancient lunar rock, ships that have waited years for this exact moment begin, at last, to wake. 2 days pass in the tense quiet of blockade. The Second Fleet holds position, patient and immovable, a wall of alien steel between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. On the bridge of the verdict of suns, Threx reviews reports with mounting irritation. "Still no response," Ur says. "No surrender, no negotiation request. Their broadcasts haven't even changed subject." What are they broadcasting? Threx asks. Yer checks the translation feed, something called a football match, and apparently a cooking competition. Vess snorts from his console. They are not taking us seriously. They will, Threx says. Send a probe squadron to the second planet. If they will not respond to words, we will remind them what silence costs. 4 scout vessels break from formation, sleek and fast, arrowing toward the second planet. Standard procedure. Intimidation flight. Buzz the orbit, demonstrate presence, return. They never make it to orbit. At exactly the boundary the conquered calls the lunar defense perimeter, and which humanity has quietly called the tripwire for 30 years, the 4 scout vessels simply stop existing. No explosion visible to conquered sensors, no missile trail, no energy signature detected before impact. Just 4 ships, then 3 ships, then 2, then none. Report, Threx snaps, rising from his chair. Yer stares at his console, hands frozen. Marshal, all 4 scouts. Gone, no warning, no return fire logged, no weapons detected in the area at all. Impossible, Vess says. There's nothing there. Our long-range scan shows empty space. Clearly, Threx says, voice tightening, our long-range scan is wrong. He stares at the blue planet on the view screen, calm and silent and utterly unbothered by the loss of 4 warships. Recall the fleet to standard perimeter, he orders. No vessel enters within 200,000 kilometers of that moon until we understand what just happened. Vess looks up, uncertainty flickering across his silver face for the first time since the mission began. Marshal, what if this isn't defense? What if it's a demonstration? Threx doesn't answer right away. He is remembering now the file that nobody in the council chamber bothered to read carefully. The scout ship, 40 years ago, that stopped transmitting and never came home. He is starting to understand that it did not fail. It was answered. Deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, in a facility the conquered sensors have scanned 11 times over 4 decades and identified only as natural geological formation, non-anomalous, Elena Cross walks a corridor lined with sleeping machines. Rows of automated defense platforms stretch into the dark, dormant since construction, waiting. Each one built from technology that did not exist on Earth 41 years ago. She stops at a viewing window overlooking a hangar the size of a small city. Inside, ships rest in cradles of dark metal, hulls absorb every photon that touches them, invisible to anything less than physical inspection. Beside her walks a man in a coalition uniform 3 ranks below her own. His name is Colonel Marcus Adami, head of special projects, and the only person alive who has read every page of the file that started all of this. They lost 4 scouts at the tripwire, Marcus says, exactly like the schedule predicted. The old man built well, Elena says. She means Dr. Ilya Voss, dead 19 years now, the scientist who examined the wreckage of a crashed alien scout ship in a Siberian field 40 years ago and understood, faster than anyone else on the planet, exactly what humanity was looking at. Not a monster, not a myth, a civilization with technology centuries ahead of humanity's own, casually surveying Earth the way a person might glance at an anthill. Voss did not panic. He did something far more dangerous. He got to work. 40 years, Marcus says, looking out over the hangar. 12,000 ships, every government on Earth in on the secret, every budget hidden inside 100 cover programs, every launch disguised as a weather satellite or a mining survey. And not one leak, Elena says, not one. Because everyone understood the stakes, Marcus says. You don't leak the only plan that keeps your species alive. Elena's calm chimes. A voice crackles through, tight with adrenaline. Admiral, this is Perimeter Command. The conquered fleet has pulled back 200,000 kilometers. They're regrouping. Copy that, Elena says. Time to Phase 2. Systems report full readiness, Admiral, whenever you give the word. Alina looks through the window one more time at the sleeping fleet, built in secret across 4 decades by a species the galaxy filed under Negligible. Not yet, she says. Let them come closer first. Admiral, they came here to deliver a verdict, Alina says. Let's make sure they're close enough to hear the appeal. Aboard the verdict of Sons, Threx stares at a tactical display that refuses to make sense. Run it again, he says. Ur runs the scan again. The result is identical: 4 dead scout ships, 0 weapons signatures, 0 energy discharge, 0 explanation. Marshal, Ur says carefully, there is one possibility we haven't discussed. Say it. Stealth technology. Something advanced enough to hide entirely from our sensors. Weapons platforms we simply cannot detect. Threx is silent for a long moment. That technology does not exist, he says finally. Not for a species we catalogued as pre-jump drive 4 decades ago. Marshal, Vess says quietly, with respect, 4 of our scouts also did not exist a few minutes ago, and they did. Threx turns to him, and for the first time there is no arrogance in his 4 eyes, only a cold, dawning unease. Send the warning broadcast again, he orders, and prepare for full engagement protocol. If this species has weapons we cannot see, then I want every gun on this fleet ready to fire the instant we see anything at all. Understood, Marshal. Threx looks back at the small blue planet, silent and patient in the dark. Whoever you are down there, he murmurs, you have exactly one more warning before I stop being curious and start being thorough. He does not know it yet, but the warning has already expired. It expired 39 years ago, the day Dr. Ilya Voss opened the hull of a crashed alien scout ship and decided that humanity would never again be caught unprepared. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret. It is an even longer time to build an army. The story of how humanity did both begins not in a war room, but in a snow-covered field outside a small town in Siberia, on a January morning that no history book outside a handful of black vaults has ever recorded. A farmer named Pyotr Ilyin found it first, a shape half buried in a frozen field, metal but not metal, warm despite the cold, humming with a sound that made his teeth ache. He called the local authorities. The local authorities called a number they had never used before, a number given to them years earlier in a sealed envelope, with instructions to open only in the event of the impossible. Within 6 hours, the site was surrounded by soldiers speaking 4 different languages, all working under a single unmarked flag. Within 6 days, the wreckage was inside a laboratory that officially did not exist, at a facility that officially did not exist, under a program that officially did not exist. Dr. Ilya Voss arrived on the 2nd day. He was 34 years old, the youngest lead scientist any government on Earth had ever assigned to a classified program, and the first human being to lay hands on a piece of alien technology and understand, immediately, that everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe was wrong. The scout ship was small, barely larger than a delivery van, but its systems were centuries beyond anything Earth had built, and Barry D in its damaged black box was something far more important than metal. Data, star charts, fleet inventories, a structure of governance spanning 600 worlds, and a single phrase translated after 11 months of round-the-clock work by a joint team of cryptographers and linguists who barely slept. File designation 4471 Terra. Status, under observation. Recommendation, monitor for compliance risk. Voss read that translation and set down his tablet very slowly. They're already watching us, he said to the room. They have been for a long time, and someday they are going to vote on what to do about us. A representative from a nation whose flag no longer exists in its original form sitting at the edge of the room in a uniform still creased from an overnight flight, spoke first, into the silence Voss's translation had left behind. "Are we certain this is genuine?" she said. "Not a hoax, not a rival program testing our response before revealing itself." Voss did not answer with words. He gestured to the scorched black box on the table between them, its casing dark and pitted, its interior humming faintly with a power source no laboratory on the planet had ever produced. "That is not something we built," he said. "It is not something anyone on this planet could build with any technology currently available to us. I have spent 11 months confirming that fact before calling this meeting. I would not waste your time otherwise." The room absorbed that in silence. "There is a second concern," Voss continued, "beyond whether the wreckage is real. If a single government moves to weaponize this alone and the others discover it, we will spend the next century fighting each other over technology we barely understand, while whoever sent that scout ship continues watching us do it." Someone in the room, a general whose name has been redacted from every surviving document, asked the obvious question. "What do we do?" Voss's answer became the founding principle of everything that followed. "We stop being negligible." What followed was not a war. It was patience, on a scale no human civilization had ever attempted. Governments that had spent decades pointing missiles at each other quietly agreed to point them at the sky instead. Rival nations that could not agree on trade tariffs found perfect, silent unity on one single point. Nobody could know. Not the public, not most of their own militaries, not the next generation of politicians unless they were personally read into the program. The cover was almost absurdly simple. Humanity was, at the time, already racing into space in full public view. Mars colonies, lunar mining, asteroid belt survey missions. Nobody questioned why so many of those missions ran over budget, over schedule, and under a level of secrecy usually reserved for nuclear weapons. Because they were. Beneath every public space program, a second, invisible one ran in parallel. Reverse-engineered alien alloys disguised as experimental composites. Reverse-engineered drive systems disguised as fusion research. Reverse-engineered targeting arrays disguised as asteroid tracking software. Every year, a little more of the scout ship's technology became a little more human. By year 10, the first true warship, built from a hybrid of human ingenuity and alien salvage, launched in absolute secrecy from a shipyard hidden inside a hollowed-out asteroid designated only by a number. They called it the Vanguard. It was smaller than a Concord scout ship and took 11 years to build. By year 20, the shipyards had multiplied. Hollowed moons, hidden stations trailing behind Jupiter in orbital blind spots, an entire second fleet growing in the dark, invisible not because of technology alone, but because nobody in the galaxy thought to look. Why would the Concord search for a fleet belonging to a species it had already filed as harmless? By year 30, Dr. Ilya Voss was an old man, dying slowly of a cancer he refused to let interrupt his work, and he gathered the program's leadership for what would be his final briefing. "I will not see the day this fleet launches," he told them. "But I need you to understand something before I go. We are not building this to win a war. We are building this so that when they finally come to vote on our existence, we are not in the room they think we are in." Nobody fully understood what he meant, not until years later when the plan's second half became clear. Because the fleet was only half of Voss's design, the other half was information. For 30 years, alongside every ship, humanity built listening posts, passive sensors hidden in the asteroid belt, in the Oort cloud on the dark side of the moon, silently absorbing every scrap of Concord transmission that passed near the solar system. Slowly, patiently, humanity built something no other species in the galaxy had ever managed. A complete map of the Concord's decision-making process, its voting patterns, its enforcement. Octrine its response times. Its weaknesses. By year 35, humanity knew with unsettling precision exactly how the conquered would eventually respond to Earth. A quarantine vote, likely triggered by growth metrics crossing an unspecified threshold. An enforcement fleet, likely between 600 and 1,000 ships, based on historical enforcement actions against comparable civilizations. A commander, likely drawn from the Korathi Enforcement Corps, based on species assignment patterns. Humanity did not just prepare for an attack. Humanity prepared for this attack. By year 40, the fleet was complete, 12,000 vessels, not because humanity expected to need 12,000 ships to defeat 800, but because Dr. Voss's final plan required more than victory. It required a message so undeniable that the conquered would never again consider Earth negligible. Alina Cross was 14 years old when Voss died. She joined the program at 19. She rose through its ranks not because of politics, but because she was, by every measure the program's leadership could devise, the single best strategic mind humanity had ever tested against a simulated conquered invasion. She ran that simulation 412 times before she was ever given real command. She won 391 of them. The other 21, she rewrote the plan until she won those too. Now, 40 years after a farmer found a crashed ship in a frozen Siberian field, Alina Cross stands in a command bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, watching 800 conquered warships hold position at the edge of her solar system, and she allows herself to think, for just a moment, of the old man who started all of this. Phase 1 complete, she says quietly to no one but herself. Let's see how Phase 2 goes. Threx does not sleep. Korathi rarely do, not in the way humans understand it, but even by his species' standards, he has not rested in 2 full days. The loss of 4 scout ships without explanation gnaws at him in a way 300 years of enforcement action never has. He has broken civilizations that fought back with fusion bombs and planet-cracking weapons. He has never faced an enemy that simply erased his ships and said nothing. Report, he says, for what feels like the 100th time. Ur straightens at his console. No change, Marshal. The Terran system remains quiet. Civilian broadcasts continue uninterrupted. No military communications detected. No fleet movement of any kind. And the tripwire? Unchanged. We have not sent another vessel near it since the incident. Vess steps closer, keeping his voice low. Marshal, might I suggest a theory? Go on. What if there is no fleet? What if this is a single, extremely advanced automated defense system? A perimeter weapon, left over from some earlier, more powerful civilization that once inhabited this system, and the Terrans themselves don't even fully understand it. It is, Threx has to admit, a comforting theory. It preserves everything the conquered believes about this species. Primitive, negligible, lucky at best to be sitting on top of someone else's leftover technology. He wants to believe it. 300 years of instinct tell him not to. Prepare a probe barrage, he orders. 50 automated drones, expendable, sent in a wide dispersal pattern toward the 4th planet. If this is an automated system, it will respond predictably to a saturation attack. If it is something else. He pauses. Then we will finally see what we are dealing with. 50 drones launch from the 2nd Fleet in a wide, staggered formation, spreading across 1,000,000 kilometers of space, arrowing toward the blue and red worlds humanity calls home. On the bridge of the Verdict of Suns, every officer watches the tactical display in silence. The drones cross the 200,000-kilometer mark. Nothing happens. They cross the 100,000-kilometer mark. Nothing happens. Perhaps Vess is right, Ur murmurs. Perhaps the defense system has a range limit and we. 41 of the 50 drones vanish from the display at once. No warning, no energy trace, No debris field large enough to register. 9 drones remain, tumbling out of formation, sensors screaming warnings before 3 more blink out in the space of a heartbeat. Report, Threx snaps. Same as before, Ur says, hands shaking slightly over his console. No detectable weapons fire, no detectable energy discharge, they are simply gone. The remaining drones scatter, attempting evasive maneuvers their creators never designed them to need. It doesn't matter. One by one, they disappear from the display until none remain. Silence falls over the bridge of the verdict of suns. That is not an automated perimeter system, Threx says quietly. That is a targeting solution more precise than anything in conquered military doctrine. Someone down there is not defending a border. Someone down there is choosing exactly which ships to kill, and killing them without ever revealing how. Vess's voice, when it comes, has lost all of its earlier confidence. Marshal, what if we were wrong about everything? What if this species did not stay quiet for 40 years because they were weak? Threx finishes the thought for him, because someone has to say it aloud. What if they stayed quiet, he says, because they were waiting? Before anyone can respond, every screen on the bridge flickers at once. A transmission, incoming, on a frequency the conquered fleet has never used and never shared with anyone outside its own command structure. Marshal, Ur says, voice tight, this is impossible. That frequency is restricted to conquered command channels. No outside species has ever cracked that encryption. Play it, Threx says. The screen resolves into a woman's face, calm, composed, standing in what is clearly a military command center, wearing a uniform none of them recognize. Fleet Marshal Threx Ilan Vase, she says, and the fact that she knows his name and rank sends a visible ripple of unease across the bridge. My name is Fleet Admiral Elena Cross, Sol Defense Command, Planet Earth. Nobody moves. You have lost 4 scout ships and 41 drones in the last 3 days, Elena continues. I want to be very clear with you, so there is no confusion about what happens next. Those losses were not an accident. They were not an automated system. They were a demonstration, conducted with less than 1% of the assets available to this system's defense grid. Threx's jaw tightens. 1%, he repeats almost to himself. You came here to enforce a quarantine voted on by 600 worlds who have never once spoken to us, Elena says. I understand why. From where you sit, we are a rounding error. A blue dot with radio broadcasts and no fleet on record. She pauses and something in her expression shifts. Not anger, something colder. You should have kept reading the file, she says. 40 years ago, one of your scout ships crashed on our planet. We didn't destroy it out of hostility. We studied it. We learned from it. And then we spent 4 decades building something the conquered has never had to face in 12,000 years of enforcement votes. What is that? Threx asks, though some part of him already suspects the answer. An equal, Elena says. The transmission cuts. For a long moment, nobody on the bridge of the verdict of suns speaks. Then every sensor station lights up at once, alarms screaming in 6 different alert tones, and Ur's voice cracks as he reads the numbers filling his display. Marshal multiple contacts, hundreds of them, no, thousands, emerging from stealth across the entire system. They were here the whole time, they were here before we even arrived. On the main view screen, space itself seems to peel back, revealing what has been hiding in plain sight behind cloaking fields more advanced than anything in the Conquered's 12,000-year arsenal. Ship after ship after ship, sleek, dark, purposeful. Not 800. 12,000. Threx stares at the number scrolling across his display and feels, for the first time in 300 years of service, something he has never had to name before. Fear. Marshal, Vess says, voice barely above a whisper, orders. Threx does not answer right away. He is watching the human fleet finish materializing around his own, a noose drawn slowly closed, every ship positioned with a precision that could only come from decades of simulation and preparation. Marshal Vespresses. Threx finally speaks, and his voice carries none of the confidence it held 3 days ago. "Signal the Conquered," he says. "Tell them Phase 1 of the quarantine has failed." Aboard the human flagship, a vessel called the UEC Prometheus, Elena Cross watches the same tactical display from the opposite side, 12,000 human ships glowing green around 800 conquered ships glowing red, and allows herself a single breath of quiet satisfaction. "Colonel," she says to Marcus, standing beside her, "signal the fleet." "What's the order, Admiral?" Elena looks at the viewscreen. At the alien fleet frozen in shock at the edge of a solar system, it came to quarantine. "Phase 2, she says, complete." Aboard a smaller escort vessel 300 kilometers off the verdict of Sun's flank, a young Korathi sensor technician named Dal Vex Ilan watches the same reveal unfold on her own console, and feels something she has never felt in 6 years of conquered service. She joined the Enforcement Corps because her family has served the Conquered for 11 generations, because the recruiters told her the Armada had never lost a war, because 300 years of unbroken victory made the uniform feel less like a risk and more like an inheritance. None of that history prepares her for the moment her display fills with green contact icons, thousands of them, unfolding out of the arcade in every direction at once. "Station report," her commanding officer snaps from across the bridge. Dahl's hands hover over her console, numbers climbing faster than she can read them. 4,000, 6,000, 8, she stops, throat tight, and forces the rest of the sentence out. 12,000 confirmed contacts, sir. We are completely encircled. The commanding officer says nothing. There is nothing useful to say. Dahl stares at the wall of green light surrounding her tiny ship and thinks, unbidden, of her grandmother, who once told her that the Armada's greatest weapon was not its guns, but the certainty that no one would ever dare test them. She understands, watching a species the Conquered catalogued as negligible reveal a fleet 15 times the size of her own, that the certainty just died. Not the guns, the certainty. Somewhere in that vast green formation, ordinary humans not so different from her, people with families and inherited service and quiet private fears of their own, are watching the same standoff from the other side. Dahl does not know their names. She will never know their names. But for the first time in 6 years of wearing this uniform, she finds herself hoping, quietly and against every instinct her training has given her, that neither side fires first. On the bridge of the verdict of Suns, Threx does not share Dahl's private hope so much as he calculates it, coldly, as the only rational outcome remaining to him. Silence falls across the bridge of the verdict of Suns like a physical weight. Threx stares at the tactical display, watching human ships continue to resolve out of the dark in numbers that should not be possible. 15 behind his flank, 200 above the ecliptic, a wall forming along his only viable retreat vector. "Marshal," Ur says, voice trembling now, "they have us surrounded on every axis. If they open fire—" "They have not opened fire," Threx says. "Note that." Ves frowns. "Marshal." 12,000 ships, Threx says slowly, arranged around 800, and not a single weapon has discharged. This is not an ambush. He straightens, forcing steadiness into his voice that he does not entirely feel. This is a demonstration. They want us to see the numbers. They want us to understand exactly how badly we misjudged them before they decide what to do with us. "Then what do we do?" Ves asks. Threx looks at the human flagship, small and unremarkable at the center of that overwhelming formation, and makes the only decision 300 years of service has prepared him to make. "We do not fire first," he says. "Open a channel." The verdict of suns transmits on the same frequency Alina Cross used moments earlier. Threx straightens his uniform, an old habit from a lifetime of delivering verdicts, and finds himself, for the first time, preparing to receive one instead. Alina's face resolves on his screen, exactly as calm as before. "Fleet Marshal," she says. "Admiral," Threx replies. The word costs him something. 300 years of enforcement doctrine does not easily grant equal rank to a species filed as negligible 4 decades ago. You have made your point. 12,000 ships, a defense grid more advanced than our own. I confess, we did not anticipate this. No, Alina agrees, you didn't. I have a question, Threx says, and I would appreciate an honest answer, Admiral to Admiral. Ask. Why did you wait? You had the capability to destroy my entire fleet the moment we crossed into your system. Instead, you let us blockade you for 3 days. You let us send drones. You let us believe we held the advantage. Alina's expression does not change, but something in her eyes sharpens. Because if we had opened fire the moment you arrived, she says, the story your council would hear is that a quarantined species attacked a lawful enforcement fleet without provocation. That story ends with a second fleet, and a third, and eventually enough ships that even we run out of numbers. She lets that settle before continuing. Instead, the story your council is about to hear is that 800 of their warships arrived to quarantine a system, lost 45 vessels to a demonstration using less than 1% of that system's defenses, and then found themselves surrounded by a fleet 15 times their size that never fired a single shot. Threx says nothing. That story, Alina finishes, ends very differently. For a long moment, the only sound on the bridge of the verdict of suns is the low hum of the ship systems. You planned this, Threx says finally. Not just the fleet, the entire sequence, the blockade, the drones, the reveal. You planned exactly how this moment would unfold decades before I was ever assigned this mission. We had a 40-year head start, Alina says. Your Conquered cataloged us once and never looked again. We had a great deal of time to imagine every version of this day and prepare for the one you act to. Ally gave us. Threx closes his eyes briefly. When he opens them, something in his posture has changed. Not quite defeat, something closer to recalculation. What happens now? He asks. Now, Alina says, you withdraw your fleet undamaged, all 800 ships, back through the same jump corridor you arrived from. You will not be fired upon. You will not be pursued. And in exchange? In exchange, Alina says, you deliver a message to your council, word for word, exactly as I give it to you. Threx straightens. I am listening. Alina's voice does not rise. It does not need to. Earth is not applying for membership in the Conquered of 12 Suns, she says. Earth is not requesting protection, alliance, or recognition. Earth is informing the Conquered that the quarantine vote is void, effective immediately, because the species it targeted possesses the capability to make that vote irrelevant. She pauses. Any further enforcement action against this system will be treated as an act of war, not a violation, not a resistance, a war, and we have spent 40 years preparing for exactly one war. Threx absorbs this in silence. You understand, he says slowly, that the Council does not respond well to ultimatums. 412 worlds voted for this quarantine. They will not simply accept defiance from a single system. They don't have to accept it, Alina says. They just have to survive learning about it. Something in the way she says it makes Vess, standing behind Threx, go very still. There is one more thing, Alina says. Tell your council this exactly. 40 years ago, one of your scout ships surveyed our planet and filed us as negligible. That report is the reason this entire conflict happened. Tell them the report was wrong. And tell them, she adds, quieter now, that we know exactly how many more systems in this galaxy have been filed the same way. negligible, unworthy of a second look. We intend to find out how many of them agree with the verdict your Conquered gave them. Threx feels something cold settle in his chest, a realization arriving with the weight of inevitability. This was never about the quarantine, he says. No, Elena confirms. The quarantine was your council's decision. What happens next is ours. The transmission ends. Threx stands motionless on the bridge of the verdict of sons for a long moment, staring at a blank screen that, moments ago, held the face of a species his entire civilization had underestimated for 40 years. Marshal, Vess says quietly, orders. Threx turns to the view screen, where 12,000 human ships hold their silent, disciplined formation around his fleet of 800. Withdraw, he says. Full retreat, standard jump corridor, no deviation. And the report to the council. Threx is quiet for a long moment. Tell them the truth, he says finally. Tell them we came to deliver a verdict to a negligible species and left having received one instead. The Second Fleet withdraws from Sol system in exact formation. 800 ships retreating through the same corridor they arrived through 3 days earlier, watched the entire way by 12,000 vessels that never once raised a weapon. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Elena watches the last Conquered ship vanish into jump space and allows herself, finally, to sit down. Admiral Marcus says, standing beside her, "That's it, they're just gone." "For now," Elena says. "You think they'll come back?" "I know they'll come back," Elena says, "just not the way they think they will." Marcus frowns. "What do you mean?" Elena looks at the star map on the main display, at the small blue dot of Earth, and beyond it, at the vast, unmapped dark of a galaxy that has spent 12,000 years believing it had already decided everything worth deciding. 412 worlds voted to quarantine us, she says, which means 188 worlds did not. Somewhere out there right now are species who watched that vote and wondered if the Conquered had finally overreached. She stands, walking toward the viewport, watching stars that no longer feel quite so distant. Marshal Threx is about to walk into a council chamber and explain how a negligible species with no fleet on record surrounded 800 warships without firing a shot, she says. Every delegate in that room is going to ask the same question. "What question?" Marcus asks. Elena turns back to him, and for the first time in 3 days, there is something almost like anticipation in her expression. What else did the Conquered get wrong? The chamber inside the dead star is louder than it has been in decades. Threx stands at the central podium, delivering his report to a gallery that has stopped pretending to be calm. 600 delegates, 12 empty thrones, and a silence when he finishes speaking that feels louder than any of the noise that preceded it. "Say that again," says the Visari Ambas. Sador coils of smoke tightening with something that might be disbelief. 12,000 ships, undetected, for 40 years. "Confirmed," Threx says. "And you retreated," says another delegate, a hard-shelled Kren commander whose species has never retreated from anything in recorded memory. 800 Conquered warships withdrew from a quarantine target without engaging. "We withdrew," Threx says, "because the alternative was not a battle. It was an extinction event, ours, not theirs." The chamber erupts into overlapping voices, translated static and clicking mandibles and drifting light, until a single voice cuts through it, sharp and clear. "Then the vote was wrong." A Kren commander slams a clawed hand against the podium rail before the chamber can recover. "Then we send the Third Fleet, 2,000 ships, enough force that no defense grid, however advanced, matters. 2,000 ships require 2,000 ships worth of fuel, crew, and jump-capable escort," counters a logistics officer from the Assembly's own Quartermaster Corps, standing reluctantly to correct him. Assembling that force would strip our border garrisons along the halving frontier by 60%. We would be defending ourselves against a hypothetical enemy at the cost of leaving a confirmed one unguarded. The humans are not our only enemy, the Kren snaps. No, the logistics officer agrees. But they are the only one who has ever surrounded 800 of our ships without firing a shot. I would suggest that earns them priority in this conversation. A Vesari elder drifts forward, coils tightening in obvious distress. We are debating troop numbers as though this is a border dispute. 412 worlds voted for a quarantine based on a file that was never verified. If that file was wrong about Terra, how many of our other votes in the last decade rested on equally unverified information? That is not the question before this session, interrupts a senior conquered magistrate, a being of crystalline structure whose voice carries the practiced calm of someone who has moderated 1,000 fractious debates. The question before this session is how the conquered responds to a demonstrated act of defiance. With respect, magistrate, the Vesari elder says, I believe it is exactly the question before this session. We do not know what we are voting on if we do not know what we got wrong. Every eye in the chamber turns toward the source. A young ambassador from a small mining world called Dorev, a species barely 2 centuries removed from conquered annexation, standing at the edge of the gallery where minor delegates are rarely permitted to speak. The conquered filed a species as negligible, the Dorev ambassador continues, emboldened by the silence, and never once verified that assessment for 40 years. How many other files in this council's archive say the same thing about worlds none of us have ever bothered to check? Nobody answers. Threx looks around the chamber, at 412 worlds that voted to quarantine a planet they never understood, and 188 that did not, and finds himself, for the first time in 300 years of service, uncertain which side history will remember as having been right. He clears his throat and delivers the final part of Alina Cross's message, word for word, exactly as instructed. The humans wish it understood, he says, that this is not a declaration of war against the conquered. It is a correction of the record. Earth will not be quarantined. Earth will not be conquered. And Earth intends to determine, for itself, how many other files in this council's archive were written about species who were never given the chance to be more than a footnote. He pauses, and the chamber holds its breath with him. They call it Phase 3, Threx says quietly. I do not know what that means. I suspect the galaxy is about to find out. Far away, beyond the reach of the dead star's cold blue light, on a small planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow sun, Alina Cross stands on a balcony, overlooking a shipyard the rest of the galaxy has only just discovered exists. Below her, new hulls rise from construction cradles that have not stopped working since the Second Fleet withdrew. Marcus joins her, watching the same skyline. The council debated for 6 hours after Threx's report, he says. No resolution, no consensus. Just 600 worlds arguing about whether they were wrong to vote us negligible in the first place. They were, Alina says. They were, Marcus agrees. But that's not really the question anymore, is it? Alina doesn't answer right away. She watches the shipyard, the lights, the decades of quiet work finally visible under an open sky. No, she says finally. The question now is how many other worlds got the same file. Negligible, not worth a second look, 40 years of silence and nobody ever checked. She turns to Marcus and there is nothing left in her expression of the calm, careful diplomat who spoke to Threx 3 days earlier. Only the quiet certainty of someone who has spent her entire life preparing for exactly this moment. The conquered spent 12,000 years deciding who matters, she says. They just found out they were wrong about one file. Let's go find out how many others they got wrong too. Behind her, across the dark side of the moon, across hollowed asteroids and hidden stations trailing Jupiter's shadow, 12,000 ships stand ready. Not for war. For whatever comes after the galaxy finally understands what it missed. The Council voted to quarantine a negligible species. Humanity voted back. And the vote is not over yet. The Dead Star Chamber does not sleep after Threx's report. It argues. For 6 hours, delegates from 600 worlds trade accusations across the cold blue light. Some demand a second fleet, larger, final, unforgiving. Others demand an apology be drafted before humanity decides to send one first. Nobody agrees on anything except the shape of the fear now sitting in the room. Threx does not speak again. He stands at the edge of the gallery, 4 eyes fixed on the empty thrones, listening to a council that spent 12,000 years never once doubting itself, now doubting everything at once. It is the Dorave ambassador, the small mining world delegate who spoke out of turn earlier, who finally asks the question nobody with real power wants to answer. If Earth built 12,000 ships in 40 years without us noticing, she says, how long before they decide the rest of us are worth noticing too? Nobody answers her, but 3 delegations quietly request private channels with the Terran system before the session even closes. Humanity answers all 3. 90 days after the Second Fleet's retreat, a coalition survey vessel named the Halcyon crosses beyond Sol system for the first time in human history under an open flag, not hidden, not disguised. It carries no weapons larger than its point defense grid. It carries something more dangerous. An offer. Its first stop is a mining world called Dorave Prime, a rust-colored planet chained for 2 centuries to conquered extraction quotas that leave its people with barely enough to survive on the world their ancestors built. The Halcyon's captain, a quiet engineer named Priya Nandakumar, who has spent 11 years training for a first contact mission she was told might never happen in her lifetime, stands before Dorave's planetary council and says the only thing Elena Cross told her to say. The Dorave council chamber is small by conquered standards, carved from the same rust-red stone that colors the whole planet, its walls lined with mining ledgers that stretch back 2 centuries. Priya stands at its center in an unarmed uniform, flanked by nothing but a single translator drone, and feels the weight of every eye in the room. We are not here to quarantine you, she says. We are not here to conquer you. We are here to ask what happens if someone finally checks the file. An elder counselor, her exoskeleton dulled from decades of underground labor, studies Priya with obvious suspicion. The conquered sent enforcers the last 3 times a species question its quota. Why would you be different? Because we're not the conquered, Priya says simply. We showed up unarmed. That was the whole point. If you don't believe anything else I say today, believe that we could have sent a warship, and we sent a survey vessel instead. The elder is quiet for a long moment, weighing that against 2 centuries of a very different lesson. And if we ask for something the conquered refuses to give, then you'll find out exactly how much that refusal costs, Priya says. We can't promise you it costs nothing. We can promise you that for the first time, somebody outside your own system is paying attention to the answer. It is not a guarantee. Priya knows that. Elena made sure every officer on the mission understood exactly how little they were authorized to promise. But it is, for Dorave Prime, the first time in 200 years that attention itself has felt like a kind of shield. Dorave Prime does not join a war. It does something the conquered has never allowed in 12,000 years of governance. It asks to renegotiate its terms. The conquered's response is immediate, and it is the mistake Elena Cross has been waiting for since the day the Second Fleet withdrew. A punitive fleet, smaller this time, 300 ships under a new commander eager to prove the Second Fleet's failure was Threx's alone, arrives at Dorave Prime to enforce compliance the old way. Overwhelming force. No negotiation. They do not know that a single coalition destroyer, cloaked, patient, has been sitting in that system for 6 days. Its name is the UEC Vigil. Its captain has one order, transmitted personally by Elena Cross before launch. "You are not there to start a war," she told him. "Why?" "Oh, are there to make sure the conquered starts one it cannot finish quietly." When the punitive fleet opens fire on Dorave's unarmed orbital stations, the Vigil decloaks, and for 11 minutes, a single human warship does something no conquered military doctrine has a name for. It does not retreat, it does not request backup, it fights. Human weapons, 40 years refined from salvaged conquered technology, and improved 1,000 times over by minds that never stopped working, tear through ships 3 times the Vigil's mass. Point defense systems calculated to a precision the conquered has never needed against an enemy that could actually shoot back. By the time the Vigil's reactor finally overloads under sustained fire, it has destroyed 41 conquered warships and crippled 60 more. It does not surrender. It does not retreat. Its final transmission, broadcast openly on every frequency in the system, reaches every delegate world watching the engagement in real time. "This is the Vigil Sol Defense Command," the recording says, calm even as the ship burns around its crew. "We came to a mining world we had known for 90 days to make sure a promise was kept. If this is the cost of that promise, we accept it. Tell the conquered humanity does not need 12,000 ships to make a point. Sometimes one is enough." The Vigil's reactor detonates 2 minutes later. Its entire crew, 31 men and women who volunteered for a mission they knew might never bring them home, dies keeping a promise to a species they had met for the first time 90 days earlier. News of the battle spreads through conquered space faster than any official report can contain it. Not because humanity releases it, but because the delegates of 100 worlds who were quietly watching Dorave Prime cannot stop talking about what they saw. A single ship, 41 warships destroyed, a message that never once asked for pity. On Earth, Elena Cross reads the casualty report in silence for a long time before she speaks. 31, she says quietly. "We knew the number when we sent them." Marcus, standing beside her, says nothing. There is nothing useful to say. "They didn't die for a mining world," Elena says finally. "They died so every species watching understood exactly what kind of promise we intend to keep. That matters more than the ship." She turns to the star map, to 100 pins now marking systems that have quietly reached out since the Halcyons' first contact. "Phase 4, she says, complete." Threx watches the recording of the Vigil's final transmission, 17 times before the emergency session convenes. He is no longer the fleet marshal who delivered the quarantine vote 4 months ago. That title was formally stripped after the Second Fleet's retreat, a punishment the Council decided was necessary to preserve the appearance of accountability. He sits now in the gallery, an advisor without a fleet, watching younger officers argue about a war he warned them not to start. "One ship," says a Kren commander, hard-shelled and furious, pacing before the 12 empty thrones. "One ship destroyed 41 of ours and we are debating whether to escalate. This is not strategy. This is paralysis." "It is not paralysis," Threx says, rising from the gallery for the first time since his demotion. Heads turn. Nobody expected him to speak. "It is arithmetic. One ship, 41 kills, 12,000 ships in reserve. If this pattern holds even remotely, the mathematics of this war favor Earth in every scenario that does not end with the annihilation of their entire species." "Then we annihilate their species," the Kren commander snaps. "With what fleet?" Threx asks quietly. "The Second Fleet retreated intact because Earth chose not to destroy it. The punitive fleet at Dorave lost 60 ships to a single vessel that chose to fight rather than flee. Explain to me which fleet you intend to send next, and I will explain to you in advance how it fails." The chamber falls silent. It is the Vesari ambassador, coils of smoke drawn tight with something that might be genuine fear, who finally asks the question that has been circling the room since the session began. "Marshal Threx," she says, using the title out of old habit rather than current fact. "You know this species better than anyone in this council. Tell us plainly, what do they want?" Threx considers the question for a long moment. "I do not think they want the Conquered's destruction," he says finally. "I think if they wanted that, the Vigil would not have died alone at Dorave Prime. 12,000 ships could have ended that engagement and this war in an afternoon. They did not send them." "Then what do they want?" the Visari ambassador presses. "They want the file corrected," Threx says. "Not just their own. Every file, every world this council has ever labeled negligible without checking twice. I believe, and I say this with no confidence, the council will accept it. Earth intends to keep proving that point, system by system, for as long as it takes for this chamber to start listening." Silence again, longer this time. "Then what do you recommend?" the Visari ambassador asks. Threx looks at the 12 empty thrones, symbols of an authority that governed 600 worlds for 12,000 years without ever once being seriously questioned, and finds himself, for the first time in his long service, recommending something no fleet marshal has ever proposed. "I recommend we ask them," he says, "not with a fleet, with a delegation." The room erupts, but this time, beneath the noise, something has shifted. Fewer voices call for war. More call for the one option the Conquered has never had to consider in 12,000 years of enforcement votes. Negotiation between equals. The delegation that eventually travels to Sol's system 3 weeks later is smaller than any Conquered diplomatic mission in recorded memory. 4 representatives, no warships, no escort beyond a single unarmed transport, painted white, broadcasting a peace signal on every frequency it knows. Threx insists on leading it himself. He is met, upon arrival, not in a grand command center or a fortified bunker, but in an open field beneath a clear blue sky, on a stretch of land the humans call, with characteristic bluntness, the Siberian testing grounds, the same field where a farmer named Pyotr Ilyin found a crashed scout ship 41 years earlier. Alina Cross meets him there personally, standing in the open air with no visible security beyond a handful of officers at a respectful distance. "Fleet Marshal," she says. "I no longer hold that rank," Threx says, "but I appreciate the courtesy." "Titles are easy to give back," Alina says. "Understanding is harder to unlearn. You came a long way to have this conversation in a field." "I wanted to see it," Threx admits. "Where it began, the scout ship, this exact spot if the coordinates in your public records are accurate." "They are," Alina says. "We don't hide that part of the story anymore. There's no reason to." Threx looks around at the wide, quiet field, at the ordinary sky above an ordinary planet the Conquered catalogued once and never looked at again. 41 years, he says. Your species used a single crashed scout ship and 41 years of silence to build something that made a fleet of 800 retreat without firing a shot, and later, something that made a single destroyer worth more than 60 of our warships. We used 41 years of being underestimated, Alina corrects gently. The technology mattered. The silence mattered more. Nobody checks a file marked negligible. Threx is quiet for a moment. I have come to ask you something plainly, Admiral, because my council can no longer afford to guess. What does Earth want from the Conquered of 12 suns? Alina considers the question with the same careful patience she has shown since the first transmission 4 months ago. 3 things, she says. First, the quarantine vote is formally struck from Conquered record, and Earth's status is changed from negligible to sovereign, unaligned, and armed. Not a member, not a subject. A neighbor your council checks with before it votes on our future again. That is achievable, Threx says. What else? Second, every file in your archive marked negligible is reviewed, properly, in person, not by a scout ship that surveys a planet once and disappears for 40 years. We will send our own observers to help if your council permits it. Some of those species may be exactly as harmless as the files say. Some, like us, may not be. Threx nods slowly, and the third. Alina's expression hardens, just slightly, the only sign of the 31 names she still carries with her from a burning ship called the Vigil. The third, she says, is that no fleet, punitive or otherwise, is ever again sent to enforce a conquered vote against a species that has not been given the chance to speak for itself first. Dorave Prime asked to renegotiate its mining quotas. Your council answered with 300 warships. That is the pattern we are here to end. Not just for us. For everyone your conquered has ever filed away without a second look. Threx stands in the quiet field for a long moment, the weight of 300 years of service settling differently on him than it ever has before. I cannot promise the council will agree to all three, he says finally. 12,000 years of doctrine does not unmake itself in an afternoon, even for a species that just proved it can end a fleet with a single ship. I know, Alina says. That's why we're not asking for an afternoon. She looks past him, toward the transport that carried him here and beyond it, toward a sky that, for the first time in human history, holds more than just their own quiet secret. We built 12,000 ships in 40 years without anyone noticing, she says. We can be patient for however long this takes. What we will not be, ever again, is invisible. In the weeks between the Vigil's sacrifice and Threx's journey to the Siberian field, the story of a single burning warship travels farther than any conquered broadcast in living memory. It reaches a gas-mining outpost near the galactic rim, where a species called the Orlathi, small and slow-moving, have paid tribute to the conquered for 6 centuries, without ever once being asked what they thought about it. An elder there watches the recording 11 times and tells her children, for the first time in her long life, that quotas are not laws of nature. It reaches a shipbuilding world deep in Kren territory, where dockworkers whisper about a species that fought back and lived to broadcast the fact. It reaches the Vesari homeworld, where coils of smoke gather in public plazas to watch the Vigil's final transmission projected against the clouds, over and over, until the words, "Sometimes one is enough," become something closer to a proverb than a battle report. Humanity does not orchestrate any of this. It does not need to. 40 years of silence taught Alina across exactly one lesson about the galaxy she was preparing to meet. Nothing spreads faster than proof. Sol Defense Command does not send another warship beyond its own system in the months that follow. It does not need to. Instead, it sends ships like the Halcyon, unarmed, open, patient, one after another to worlds that reach out on frequencies the conquered never monitored closely enough to notice were being used. 17 systems make contact in the first 90 days, 41 by the time Threx stands in the Siberian field. Some are curious, some are frightened. A handful, cautiously, quietly, begin asking questions their own governments have never dared to ask a conquered observer. What happens if we say no? Sol Defense Command's answer is always the same, delivered by whichever officer happens to be standing in the room, because Alina Cross made sure every one of them memorized it before the first ship ever launched. We don't know yet, but for the first time, someone is willing to find out with you. It is not a promise of protection. Alina is careful about that in every briefing, every transmission, every quiet conversation with a nervous ambassador on a mining world 300 light-years from home. Humanity has 12,000 ships. The conquered, even wounded and divided, still commands tens of thousands across 600 worlds. No single fleet, however advanced, can guarantee safety to every voice that decides to speak up. What humanity offers instead is smaller, and in its own way, far more dangerous to 12,000 years of conquered doctrine. Proof that speaking up is survivable. That proof does more damage to the old order than any weapon in the human arsenal. Fleets can be replaced. Ships can be rebuilt. What cannot be undone, once it exists, is the memory of 100 worlds who watched a single coalition destroyer trade its life for someone else's mining quota, and understood all at once that fear had quietly stopped being the only available answer. Threx sees it happening in real time, in the increasingly fractured sessions of the council chamber, where 412 worlds that once voted in perfect, silent unity now argue for hours over questions nobody thought to ask a year earlier. He sees it in the Kren delegation, traditionally the loudest voice for overwhelming force, now quietly divided between commanders who want a third fleet and commanders who have started asking, for the first time in their species' long service to the conquered, what exactly they have been enforcing all this time. He sees it most clearly in himself. A fleet marshal stripped of his fleet, standing in an empty gallery, no longer certain the verdicts he delivered for 300 years were ever really verdicts at all. 6 months after the field meeting in Siberia, the Concord of 12 Suns convenes the largest session in its recorded history, not to vote on quarantine, to vote on review. Every file in the Concord archive marked negligible, dormant, or unverified, 1,412 worlds in total, is placed on a schedule for reassessment, conducted jointly by Concord observers, and a small, newly formed division of Sol Defense Command that the humans, with characteristic bluntness, have started calling the Second Look program. It is not peace. Threx is careful to say so in every report he files for the rest of his life. The Conquered does not trust Earth. Earth does not trust the Conquered. Old doctrine dies slowly, and somewhere in the galaxy, another commander is undoubtedly already dreaming of the fleet that will finally succeed where the Second Fleet failed. But it is a start, and for a species that spent 40 years building an army in total silence just to earn the right to be seen, a start is enough. On the day the review vote passes, 409 worlds to 191, Elena Cross stands once more on the balcony overlooking the shipyard that first became visible to the galaxy 9 months earlier. The hulls below her have not stopped rising. They never will, not entirely. Some habits, once necessary for survival, do not simply switch off because a vote finally went the right way. Marcus joins her, reading the final tally on a data pad. 409 to 191, he says. Closer than I expected. Closer than it should have been, Elena says. But it's a real number, cast by delegates who actually debated it, instead of 412 worlds rubber-stamping a quarantine they never bothered to question. You think it'll hold? Elena watches the shipyard, the slow, patient work of a species that has learned the true cost of being underestimated, and understands better than anyone alive that vigilance and peace are not opposites. They are partners. It'll hold as long as we make sure it's cheaper to check the file than to ignore it, she says. That's not diplomacy. That's just good arithmetic. She turns from the balcony, back toward the command center, back toward the work that will not end simply because one vote finally changed. 40 years ago, she says, a farmer found a crashed ship in a frozen field, and a scientist named Ilya Voss decided this planet would never again be a footnote in someone else's file. He didn't live to see today. Most of the people who built this fleet in secret never expected to see it either. She looks out one last time at the ships rising into the pale morning light, 12,000 strong and still counting, a fleet built not for conquest, but for the simple, unbreakable right to be taken seriously. The council spent 12,000 years deciding who mattered, Elena says, without ever once being told no. She steps back inside, the doors closing behind her on a sky that no longer belongs only to the conquered. Now they know how to spell it. Far beyond the edge of conquered space, past territory no human ship has ever charted and no conquered scout has surveyed in over 1,000 years. Something has been listening. It does not belong to the conquered of 12 suns. It does not belong to any species the Council has ever catalogued. It has watched the quarantine vote, the retreat of the Second Fleet, the burning of a single destroyer over a mining world, and the long, slow unraveling of an order that has stood unquestioned for 12,000 years, and it has done what patient, ancient things do best. It has taken notes. In a chamber far darker and far older than the dead star at the heart of the conquered, something that has never needed a name reviews the same recording Threx watched 17 times. The final transmission of the vigil, 31 voices, calm even as their ship burned around them. It does not feel fear, the way Threx did on the bridge of the verdict of suns. It has not felt fear in longer than the conquered has existed. It feels something closer to interest. A file opens, ancient and vast, cross-referencing a small yellow star, a small blue planet, and a designation that has sat untouched in its archives for far longer than humanity has walked upright. The file does not say negligible. It never did. On Earth, none of this is known yet. Elena Cross sleeps, for the first time in months, without a briefing waiting for her the moment she wakes. The shipyards keep building. The Second Look program sends its first joint observers to a dozen worlds the conquered never bothered to check twice. A species that spent 40 years preparing for a war it hoped would never come has, for now, won the only war it was actually fighting. But somewhere, past the edge of every map humanity has ever drawn, an old and patient thing has just begun to pay attention. And it has not voted yet. And